Best essays, a number of characteristics of the best essays. They do use the words from the question, certainly in the introduction and sometimes within the essay to help them stay on track. If you are forcing yourself to use the words of the essay, you may be forcing yourself to answer the question. And also you're drawing the marker's attention to it that you are answering the question. The best essays sustain an argument by supporting that argument with relevant detail. The best essays use specific rather than general terms. So an example here from 2010, question 21B asked you to talk about civilians in Europe. Now, you don't just leave it at civilians, you be specific. You talk about Jewish people, gypsies, slaves, homosexual people, etc., and how they fared under the Nazi occupation. Use evidence from historians, if relevant, to support their argument. Be careful about name-dropping historians. Good students will certainly support what they're saying, their own views with the views of historians, and sometimes analyse those views, but just be careful about simply name-dropping in which really takes you nowhere. If you are using historians, better to paraphrase rather than memorise long quotes. Address the full question, if not evenly. So in other words, if the question has a number of parts or asks you to consider a number of things, you try to do all of that, if not giving the same attention to each part. Address the full period, but maybe not evenly. And notice here the significance of dates in exams. If the question's asking you to deal with something up to a specific date, say 1929, then that date probably means something. If it's American history, for example, it may be an obvious reference to the Depression. If it says 1920s, that's a bit more general, a bit more open-ended, and finally, if it has no date, therefore you have a lot more freedom as to where you end it. Do not, under any circumstances, have a long background. If your national study begins in 1917, then you pretty much begin your answer in 1917. Use the opportunity when asked to a question that says to what extent or evaluate the view, then think about how you're going to approach such questions. If the question is evaluate the view, for example, that Mikhail Gorbachev was responsible for ending the Cold War, you can't simply say, oh, Mikhail Gorbachev had no influence whatsoever in entering the Cold War, in ending the Cold War, and I'll tell you about something else that I'm prepared to tell you. You can't dismiss the focus of the question. You can argue that Mikhail Gorbachev was not responsible, but you must argue it. You must spend time with the focus of the question. Whatever you do on an essay, do not go over time. The temptation for students is to get to their 45 minutes and think, I'll get a few more marks by writing a few more paragraphs. You must leave 45 minutes for the last essay in the paper. You must stay on time. Common mistake of students in their trial is to lose track of time. But try to stay on track with your trial exam and certainly with your HSC. And just be aware, I suppose, that when you are at the end of an essay, the conclusion in an exam is far less important than the introduction. Don't spend a long time thinking that you have to write a very elaborate conclusion. You've probably clinched the marks by the time you're there. And if you're not finished the paper, you're probably better off putting full stop and going on to the next question. If you don't finish a question, by the way, whatever you do, do not write, sorry, not finished. Let the examiner figure that out for themselves, all right? Personality questions divided into two parts, and both parts must be done. Each part needs to be labelled and done separately. So when you're answering A, you write A, you answer that. When you're answering B, you go to a new page, write B. Don't go over time on this section. Because it's in two parts, that's where the temptation is to go over time. Ensure that you only give 45 minutes to the entire question so that you've left time again for the last question you're going to do. If we look at part A of this, it will generally ask you for a descriptive response. In other words, it's meant to be reasonably easy as compared to other questions in the paper. Prepare for this question by having a very good understanding of the key events in your personality's lifetime. And also be able to relate those key events to key historical events in their lifetime. Write concisely, don't go over time, and above all, answer the question asked. If we go to part B of the personality question, this is immediately different than part A. It's meant to be more demanding. You're asked to analyse rather than just describe. And usually it comes with a quote, and the quote is integral to the question. It can't be ignored, it must be used. How do you use it? Well, firstly, you can't quickly refer to the quote in the first paragraph and refer to the quote in the final paragraph and think that it's been used. It will generally ask you to make a judgment in terms of the quote that's been given, and if that's the case, that judgment needs to form the discussion in your essay. So your response must support that judgment that you've come to about the quote all the way through the essay and integrate reference to the quote, use of the quote in the whole essay. Be very careful about simply repeating what you may have already written in Part A. Sometimes the detail from Part A about the personality's life may be relevant in order to respond to the quote and the question in Part B, and certainly do repeat it if it is relevant, but just be very careful about merely doing the description or the narration again. Prepare for this question by developing an understanding of historians' views about your personality. And most of the personalities have been deliberately chosen so that there is some controversy about them. But also with this, be very careful about becoming fixated. So for example, the most popular personality is Albert Speer, one of the German topic personalities. And a big question here is, was he a real Nazi, or did he just get caught up in it? But whatever you do, don't go into the paper just with that single response prepared, because the question may take you in another direction. Definitely, again, have an understanding of the personality's relationship to historic events, and above all, repeating this phrase yet again, answer the questions asked in the paper. Write this response here as a mini essay, but ensure once again that you don't go over time. Just using as an example, if we have a look at the quote in the 2010 paper, the quote given was, "People are swept along by events. Some individuals use events to advantage." Question: how accurate is this statement in relation to the personality you have studied? Well, as in most years, the quote can be applied equally well to most of the personalities. You can adapt it and it can help you form a good argument. In fact, it's a huge help to students because it gives you that originality in the exam. You're asked to respond to that in the exam and create a discussion around a judgment around that quote. So definitely sit there, it's worth the time spending the 5 minutes doing the planning. So your argument could be that your personality was swept along by events, they used events to their advantage, or in fact the situation varied over time, as it often did. Just take 3 examples. Our most popular personality, Albert Speer, was he swept up in the Nazi movement? Or did he actually control events and take advantage of every opportunity, including what he did in later life after he came out of prison? Anybody who's studied Albert Speer should see straight away that the question is tailor-made and could give you a very coherent discussion going through his whole life, examining how well that quote applies to him. What about General MacArthur? He was swept out of the Philippines by the Japanese advance at the start of the conflict in the Pacific, so he had not much control over that. But no sooner did he arrive in Australia than he said, "I shall return." In fact, he declared his intention now of taking control of events. And this is exactly what he did. He arrived in Australia without an army and did everything in his power to ensure that he was given an army and that he could get back into control of events, and finally ended up in Japan at the end of the war as virtually the ruler of Japan. So it's an example of where, to a certain extent, he's swept along by historic events, but then takes over and uses them to an advantage. What about Emperor Hirohito? Wonderful historiographical debate here, and this is where studying the personality from an historiographical point of view will prepare you for this question. Was he the constitutional monarch, the figurehead, who was just swept along by events, the poor monarch whose militarists got him into all sorts of trouble? Or was he in fact in charge, always the skillful manipulator of events, prior to the war, during the war, and during the American occupation? So again, just by looking at the 3 personalities there, and we could go through each of the ones that students are studying and see that the quote is in fact not so difficult to apply if we sit down and plan a response to it, so that we're going to deal with it through our full question. All right, just a final couple of suggestions now about what you would do in revision for the trial or in revision for the HSC. Definitely tick off the syllabus. Get a hold of the syllabus and tick off the topics that you are doing and ensure that you understand all the content outline, all the problems and issues. Repackage your notes, fill gaps, find out where your notes need to be extended, address any questions that you have. Learn stuff, underestimate it. Write things out, self-test. Knowledge is really important. Just like prior to doing the test for your licence. Students are quite capable there of learning things by rote. Do that in preparation so that you have the factual detail able to support your responses. Summarise relevant historians' views, but again, avoid long quotes. World War I, where you're asked to do source work, a good way of familiarising with the overview, the story, is to read a good book prior to an exam. Definitely look at past papers, but be cautious about anything prior to 2006 for the personality or anything prior to 2010 for Part A of the core. Write practice essays, but don't expect to rewrite them in the exam. Write them as practice, but expect to see a different question in the exam. Prepare brief comfort sheets or facts and ideas for the late revision. So you've got single sheets of paper to look at. Ensure that you prepare for your trial exam. It's the dress rehearsal for the high school certificate. Perfect opportunity. Sometimes mistakes are made with technique, exam strategy in the trial. It's best to think about these things before the trial and use that as a good dress rehearsal. And finally, when the trial's over, ensure that in the few months between the trial and the HSC that you keep working, that you actually perfect what you've done, your preparation. And so